Good afternoon. Thank you, Kathy, David, Sheila, the whole NCPN community. Started out relatively early this morning. It's almost 5 o'clock and you're still here. I give you a lot of credit for your passion. And thank you for participating in this last session of the day. It's true, I have been a passionate supporter of career technical education. There supposedly is over a million, there are over 1 million lawyers in the United States. I'm probably the only one with this background of 35 years plus working in the career tech field. And maybe that explains part of the passion that I have. But for those of you that I've had the opportunity to interact with in the past, you know I don't come here today to present you a position of any particular constituency. I speak really in an unfiltered, uncensored way. The opinions that I'm going to offer you this afternoon are really my own. I wish we would have time for questions at the end. I tend to doubt it. I'll certainly be sticking around if you do have questions. I will be doing a more informal session on particular implementation issues of Perkins tomorrow morning, and I look forward to the opportunity to talk to you then about specific questions. I'm going to talk specifically about, if we can get the PowerPoint up, 2 issues today. What can the CTE community expect in terms of federal funding? What is the federal role in CTE? And they are directly connected. Funding is connected to the mission. And as you'll see in my comments to you here this afternoon, because the mission has changed so much in career tech since it was really first authorized back in 1963, it has been very difficult to seek increases in federal funding. And I think you'll get the message once I go through these slides with you. But let's start with the issue of funding. And I wish I could stand here today and tell you exactly what is going to happen with regard to federal support for career tech. But believe me, nobody in the United States knows the answer to that question right now. There are too many variables, and I want to share those variables with you. Before I get to the exact dollars, for those of you who are relatively new to the enterprise, you need to understand that Perkins, as with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, Adult Education, the Elementary Secondary Education Act, are programs that are advance funded. And what that means is that in an ideal world, Congress will appropriate funds on October 1 for the succeeding July 1 period, so that we would know 9 months ahead of time what the funding would be for career technical education. And today, being mid-October, we should know what the funding would be for July 1, 2013, but we don't. We have a placeholder, a fiction, in place with regard to that funding level right now, and I will explain that to you. Congress sets the appropriation amount in their annual Education Department, Health and Human Services, Department of Labor appropriation. It's rarely ever done on time. It was not done this particular year. They instead passed a continuing resolution. But regardless of what the funding level is, you need to understand that funding for career technical education, as for the other major state-administered programs, is bifurcated. The states and the locals and the colleges are only entitled to 25% of that funding on July 1, and they have to wait until October 1 to receive the other 75%. Now, you might sit here and say, well, that really is no big deal, but it's going to be a very big deal in the coming year because of sequestration. And I want to pull all these pieces together for you. But once that dollar amount is set by Congress, those funds are distributed to the 50 states and the territories based on population. And then the states, in turn, make the decision, not Congress, but the states, in turn, make the decision how much to go to secondary career tech, how much to go to post-secondary. It's a state discretionary determination by the sole state agency. But once that split is made between secondary and post-secondary, The funds must go to school districts and colleges based on a formula driven primarily by poverty figures at post-secondary, Pell figures, at secondary, primarily Title I population figures. But the money typically goes where the poverty and the population are located. The state has no control over how funds are allocated once the split is made between secondary and post-secondary. So looking at this chart, for the period that we are in right now, July 1, 2012 to June 30, 2013, the figure is $1.13 billion, again, split among the 50 states and territories by population. And the next figure that you see next year with the bracket CR, continuing resolution, is exactly 0.62 of 1% more than what the funding is this year. So you're sitting here and you might say, well, that's all well and good. On July 1, 2013, my college, my district, my state is going to get a little bit more than what it received for the current year. And I say not so fast, because that truly is a fiction. It's simply a placeholder. Congress wanted to leave town at the end of September, so they passed this continuing resolution, which only goes for 6 months through March. And a lot will happen between now and the end of March when Congress sets the exact figure for career technical education for the period beginning on July 1, 2013. Well, what are they? Well, one major concern is sequestration. And for those of you, and unless you've been, have had your head buried in the sand, you've had some familiarity with that term sequestration. But last year, Congress passed the Congressional Budget Control Act and set up a super committee, which was not too super, to come up with funding and revenue cuts across both discretionary and defense programs. And they gave them 90 days until Thanksgiving of 2011 to do that. They failed to come up with a compromise, and by failing to come up with a compromise, that Congressional Budget Act said that there will be across-the-board cuts on all programs, defense and discretionary programs, education programs, for the next 10 years. And that the first trigger would occur on January 2, 2013. Now, when Congress enacted this legislation in August of 2011, January 2, 2013 seemed like far away. Well, here we are, middle of October of 2012, and now that date is not so far away. It's certainly less than 90 days away. And these pending cuts, across-the-board cuts, coupled with the expiration of what's called the so-called Bush tax cuts, has picked up the term the fiscal cliff. And the question is, are we going to face this fiscal cliff with the tax cuts going into place, eliminating the tax cuts on December 31, and then the sequestration to defense and social programs 48 hours later? 45 days ago, I would have said with 100% certainty, Congress will take the necessary action to rescind the sequestration. I firmly believe that there was almost 100% certainty that Congress would rescind the sequestration, amounting to approximately an 8.2% cut to career technical education, at least for next year. I'm not so sure now, I'm not 100% certain that Congress, once it returns after the election, has the political wherewithal to make the necessary decisions to rescind that sequestration. The president simply cannot issue an executive order saying we're doing away with the sequestration. It's got to be an act of Congress. And if it happens, it's got to happen before January 2. It will certainly happen during the lame duck session after the election. And obviously, the outcome of the election will have a lot to do with whether or not that sequestration is rescinded. So just for the sake of argument, If they do not rescind it, how will it impact the work that you do? Now, the way it is set up and the way it was initially interpreted by the White House and the Office of Management and Budget was that the cuts would affect the funding for the current fiscal year. Remember I said funding for CTE is bifurcated, 25% on July 1, 75% on October 1. It was set up so that the 75% that the states, locals, and colleges received on October 1, 2012, 2 weeks ago, would be subject to that 8.2% cut. And now you're sitting here and you're saying, well, wait a minute, we've already been promised that money. We've entered into contracts with teachers, vendors, curricula, professional development. How can they take that money away? Well, that's exactly what happens with sequestration. However, last month, OMB issued a memorandum to the chief state school officers in the U.S. Education Department in which it said for education state-administered programs, ESEA, special ed, career tech, we will defer the cuts until July 1, 2013. So the way it is currently set up, the first 8.2% would be against the 25% that the states receive on July 1, 2013 for Perkins. But then the next appropriation, that 75% that comes available on October 1, 2013, that would also be subject to approximately the 8.2% as well. It's a double whammy. And folks don't understand that. It is set up as a double whammy. So in all, potentially there's about a 14% cut against the funding that would be available for CTE for the period July 1, 13 to June 30, 14. That will happen unless Congress has the wherewithal to rescind it. But there are other factors as well. Depending on the outcome of the election, the House of Representatives has already enacted what's called the Ryan budget, which is a framework for moving forward. And the Ryan budget, as you see there in this chart, shows a 5% cut for the period beginning July 1, 13 across the board, and then an additional 15% cut for July 1, 2014. So that would bring funding down all the way to $866,000. Now, I think most of us watched the presidential debate 2 weeks ago in Denver, and the education community within the Beltway was rather stunned when Governor Romney indicated, I do not plan any cuts for federal support for education. But he immediately said after that, he said, however, we want the dollars to follow the child with both the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act and the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. I think he was focusing on those two bills. I'm not sure he was speaking in generally across the board for the approximately 150 programs that are administered by the Secretary of Education. So no one really knows, but clearly there are looming cuts out there depending on what happens with sequestration, what happens with the presidential election. So no one knows for sure. We need to see how this is going to play out. Now, I think the key question is, let's look at federal support for career technical education over the long term, a 30-year period, from, say, 1980, from the beginning of maybe Perkins 1, which was 1984, until today, 2012. And if you looked at a 30-year track record for Perkins, you would see that it's essentially been flatlined. When I was a federal official back representing the U.S. Office of Education, funding for special education was comparable to funding for career technical education. Let me repeat that. Back in the 70s, funding for career tech was at the same level that funding was for special ed. It was less than $1 billion, a little less than $1 billion back then. While CTE has remained flatlined all these years, Special ed is now funded at $11 billion. ESEA, Title I, is funded at $14 billion. And I think we have to ask ourselves, why is that? Why is that? Why has that happened? And I think that, at least in my opinion, we've got to look at what is the mission of career technical education in terms of the federal government. When Congress created the U.S. Education Department in legislation in 1978, and then it went into being in May of 1980, it said the mission of the U.S. Education Department is twofold. One is to promote excellence, and the other is to promote opportunity. So the question is, how does federal support for career technical education fit into that mold of promoting excellence and promoting opportunity? And to answer that question, I think we need to take a look back in history to see how the process has evolved. Now, right now, there's a lot of noise coming out of the Beltway as to the future of the federal role in career technical education. I know that there have been a number of sessions dealing with reauthorization, and I will build up to where we will go, in my opinion, with Perkins 5. But it was just less than 2 years ago that the Secretary of Education, in a speech to the state directors of career tech in Washington, D.C., gave the following quotation. He said, "At a time when local, state, and federal governments are all facing tremendous budget pressure, advocates for vocationally oriented education must make a compelling case for continued funding." And that comment by Secretary Duncan was met by doom and gloom by much of the CTE community. I mean, what was that based on? Why was the Secretary not embracing enhanced, augmented federal support for career technical education? Was he relying on his observations as a local superintendent and the vocational education system and infrastructure that existed in Chicago? I don't know. Was he looking at old data under former bills, Perkins 2, Perkins 3? Was he looking at Perkins 4? I don't know. But he did give a negative picture as to where he saw at the time federal support for vocational education. And then you compare that to the recent Harvard study, Pathways to Prosperity, which said that career tech clearly must be a part of comprehensive school reform. And it addresses the career-ready piece of education reform that the president has talked about. And we've been getting everything in between in terms of where is the federal government going to go with support for career technical education. Well, let me take you on a journey that really starts back 49 years ago with the Vocational Education Act of 1963. Now, why am I doing this? Because the law that we operate under today, the Perkins Act, Perkins 4, is an amendment to the Vocational Education Act of 1963. It is in 1963, really under the Kennedy administration, that the federal government decided to make the investment in career technical education. Interesting, it was 2 years before Congress made the investment in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and 2 years before Congress made the investment in the Higher Education Act. What came first in terms of federal support was vocational education. Let me just share with you a couple quotes from the conference report of the House and Senate back in 1963. It is the purpose of this bill to redirect and expand federal financial assistance to vocational education so as to assure vocational education opportunities for all citizens, which will be of high quality and realistic in terms of the nation's actual manpower needs and job opportunities. Opportunity and excellence, again, aligned with what the federal mission is. This report, and this is fascinating to me, and I hope that you find it as interesting yourself. 49 years ago, today's labor market is characterized by the paradox of persistent unemployment occurring simultaneously with rising demand for skilled manpower. The specter of technological unemployment has done much to attract attention to anachronisms in our education system. Our vocational education programs, developed in another era because they were deemed essential to economic progress, fall far short today of meeting the greatly stepped-up needs of these times, 49 years ago. Probably more advances have been made in science in the past 50 years, from say 1913 to 1963, than in all preceding human history, and 90% of the scientists who ever lived are alive today. But the scientist without the supporting technician is handicapped, and the production is held back because of shortages of skilled manpower for the variety of new functions that derive from scientific discovery. Again, a quote from 49 years ago. So Congress passed this 1963, let me move back, this 1963 Act. What's fascinating about this advance in making the federal investment was really what happened back then. There were no comparable federal education programs that had a concept of a state plan. None had a concept of a local plan. None had a concept of a sole state agency called a state board of vocational education. Vocational education, the Vocational Education Act, essentially broke ground for all other federal education programs with these concepts: state plan, local plan, sole state agency responsible for a state-administered program. Not ESEA, not special ed, but vocational education. Although modest in funding back in 1963, Congress said to the states, take these dollars and build an infrastructure to support career technical education. And Congress said, you may use the funds, and we urge you to use the funds for construction of facilities. Yes, the 1963 Act said to the states, build the schools. Use federal funds to build the schools. Support, expand vocational education, but giving the utmost flexibility to states, colleges, and locals as to how the funds would be used. Back in those days, every federal education program had a shelf life of 5 years. And sure enough, 5 years later, Congress came to reauthorize the Vocational Education Act of '63, and they simply called it the Vocational Education Amendments of 1968. And again, the new frontier was set by vocational education, not ESEA, not special education. Congress in 1968 set out a new concept called set-asides. We had never seen this concept in education before of set-asides. It was a carrot-and-stick approach. Congress said, if you spend 10% of your federal vocational education funds on disabled students, and if you spend 15% of your vocational education funds on disadvantaged students, disadvantage is being defined as both academically and economically disadvantaged, then you could take the 75% and do what you want with it to support career technical education. A carrot and stick, which became very fashionable in other federal education programs. The 1968 legislation mandated that every state participating in vocational education had to establish a state council on vocational education comprised of the private sector to advise the state board on the rollout, to give business, industry, labor the opportunity to intersect with the state local bureaucracies as to how curricula was being fashioned in that state. Again, first state program to have a state council advising the state board. So vocational education for so many years was the champion. Then how did I intersect with this? In fact, I was a law student back in my home state of Connecticut, and a civil procedure professor came up to me and he said, Michael, the state of Connecticut wants to sue the U.S. Office of Education in the way that they are allocating the federal vocational education funds. Would you like to work with the state in presenting and putting that brief together? And I was studying at the time to be a criminal defense lawyer, and being a starving law student, I said, well, I would do that, but I'm not going to do it on a pro bono basis. You'll have to pay me an hourly wage for the work that I do in developing these briefs. We sued in federal district court along with the state of Arkansas back in 1972. And we litigated this case in terms of the way federal funds were being distributed for the smaller states and more rural states. And lo and behold, the folks from the U.S. Office of Education said, we'd really like you, Michael, to come down to Washington, D.C., and perhaps serve as the counsel for what was then a branch with adult education, vocational education, and a number of other programs, which I did. And I got very much involved with writing the regulations under the 1968 program. But that was short-lived because things changed radically 2 years later in 1976 when Congress said, we are going to shift gears. We're going to move away from the Vocational Education Act being a technical education delivery system to one which will be a statement on social policy. Yes, a statement on social policy, equating it with affirmative action. And Congress boldly said in 1976 that if any state wanted to participate in the Vocational Education Act, they had to appoint an individual to work full-time to eliminate gender equity in vocational education. They not only had to use 10% for the disabled, they had to match it dollar for dollar. Not only 15% for the disadvantaged, they had to match it dollar for dollar. But now they had to serve set-asides for the limited English proficient, single parents, pregnant teenagers. And the list went on, replete with all of these set-asides or reserves, and saying to the states, no, you're really no longer going to have that flexibility in how you decide to use it. We're going to decide, we're going to divide the pie up. And this was, in a sense, a radical turn, that you had an education statute that was more aligned with civil rights compliance and enforcement than it was really with education.